Good afternoon to everyone. Wanted to welcome you all. Thank you for taking time to join the webinar today. We are excited to have you as Forelli continues in our webinar series to try and make sure that we are supporting the higher ed community and with timely and topical subject matter. We are looking forward to you guys participating in the rolling out of Azure Windows Virtual Desktop environment, and that's specifically for remote and student labs. Go ahead. So we're going to get to introductions in 1 second, but I did want to talk a little bit about questions and just kind of the house rules, if you will. One, if you have a question in the middle of the webinar or presentation, please feel free to put that into the chat window. There's a chat icon at the bottom of your screen, and you can open that up and it'll bring up a chat bar, and we will get to all questions. If it's not answered in moment during the presentation, we will definitely circle back to it. So I will be monitoring that and make sure all questions get answered. We'd like for everyone's microphones to please stay muted while we're going through. And lastly, we know that you'll probably be taking some notes, and that's fine, but also wanted to assure you that you will have the opportunity to reference both the slide deck as well as the presentation, as we will be sending out a link for reference of this webinar. So feel free to take notes, but know that you will have that to fall back on. With that, I will turn it over to Robert Forelli and Christine Bailey.
Hi, I'm Rob Forelli. I have 20 years plus in higher education and technology. Founded Forelli in 2003. When I worked back then, it was only myself working 2 days a week. We're now a firm of 60 plus specialists, and I've worked with over, I think 300 institutions is probably the light. We're probably at 4 at this point. And just really happy to have the opportunity to be able to present this to folks. We've been getting, what we're trying to do is we're trying to come up with presentations in areas where we're getting a lot of demand. And right now, this is an area of major demand, and happy to hopefully give you the opportunity to do some of this yourself as well.
And I'm Christine. Sorry, so I got a new notification. So I'm a senior consultant here, and I sit on the security cloud infrastructure team. A lot of the schools that I work with, what I do is try to strengthen security posture, and in that regards to whatever project that we're bringing on board for them. So if it's an infrastructure project, what are we bringing them into, assessing where they're at in their security controls, and then helping them put those items in place, or just turning things on that they didn't realize they had in their organization. Lately, my focus has been cloud security assessments and looking at their environments. Some of them do have Azure tenants, some of them have AWS tenants, and then seeing where they stand in those current builds and what's deployed, where they need cleanup at, and then also helping them build out these the virtual desktop environments. As we grow into this and as we speak about this, making this be a part of your current security plan and adhering to those security rules that you keep on-prem, it's still possible to do in the cloud. So we will talk about those things as well during this presentation. You can go ahead, Rob.
All right, so right now we're going to have a pop quiz. We'd like to get a sense of what folks use for email and file storage.
Looks like we are office-based.
I do feel like it's a little bit weighted due to the content.
That is true. That is true. We did lead them down that path with what we're going over.
Okay, it looks like we have 70% are using O365, 17% on G Suite, and 13% with their email and file sharing in-house. So thank you. And now we're going to have our second poll. We want to just get a sense of what kind of experience you've had with infrastructure as a service or platform as a service today, just to see if you've had the opportunity to work with Amazon AWS, Microsoft Azure, Google Compute, Oracle Cloud.
Okay.
Okay, nice.
Excellent. I got a good mixture, and well, you know, what I will say is we'll have a little bit of something for everyone here.
Okay.
And so, what are we seeing today? And this is what kind of prompted this presentation. To date, most schools are using VPN for remote access to their institution resources. And usually these are, you know, the VPN access is for a select number of employees to access some very specific resources. It was never a solution for the entire employee base to be off campus, and I don't believe it was ever a solution. I don't know many schools that even offer a VPN solution for students. Additionally, we, you know, with so many people having to leave campus and employees having to work remotely, we potentially have a lot of unmanaged devices being used to access work resources with no or limited security. And another challenge that we're facing ourselves here at Forelli, because of supply chain disruptions, it's difficult in getting new hardware, new laptops to the end user community. So these are the challenges that we see kind of faced over the overall client base. In the past month, over 300 universities have moved to an online only learning environment. And what I will say is if you're still struggling, you're not alone. We're working with a number of schools that are still struggling to make that switch over. And we really live in an uncertain future. You know, when this first started, I've heard end dates of April 30. As of yesterday, I've gotten a new, you know, a quarantine up until May 15. We're now hearing in the news that some schools are considering doing their fall 2020 semester online. There's the potential where we move out of quarantine, but there might be specific counties or cities or areas that still have to remain in quarantine, since it's up to the governors to make these decisions. So we got to be prepared not only for what's happening today, but what could potentially happen in the, you know, in the future. So how can we solve this problem using cloud computing? And what I will say is cloud computing is the perfect platform for some of these challenges. And what I want to do is I just want to kind of give you a little bit of background of the different levels of cloud computing out there. And so any of you that are using Gmail, Google Docs, Office 365, Salesforce CRM, Microsoft Dynamics, that is called software as a service. So they're pretty much bundling everything together. Everything in this triangle is bundled up and delivered as a part of software as a service, and it's delivered directly to that end user. And so, you know, I've heard some folks say that it's kind of like taking a bus. You have your TransPass, you get on, you do what you need to do, and then you you get off. If we move down the chain a little bit, we get to what is called platform as a service. So this is a platform where we could build those software as a service entities. And, you know, this has traditionally been for software developers. So things like Force.com, Power Apps from Office 365, .NET containers in Azure, AWS, Elastic, Beanstalk. These are all platforms that we could build off of. And Windows Virtual Desktop is a platform as a service. And you know, if we use the transportation analogy, this is kind of like taking a taxi cab. So, you know, you got a little bit more granular control over it. And then all the way down bottom is infrastructure as a service. And so this is the Microsoft Azure platform, Google Compute, AWS. And, you know, this is essentially, if you think of your server room in your college, we could take that entire server room and place it on these platforms. And so it, you know, it allows you to replicate your complete infrastructure in the cloud. And again, you know, it could be like, think of it like leasing a car. You know, you're basically, you could drive it when you want. It sits in your driveway if you want it to sit there. You know, you have a high level of control over the infrastructure, and basically it all stacks up and builds up on one another.
Okay, so where that leads us is, where does Windows Virtual Desktop fall in place? Going back to this, so it's a little bit of both. And the reason that that's important to understand, which we will get to later in the slides, is where your responsibility sits and what you have to control and what they're going to control for you. If you're used to your traditional RDS on-prem deployment, you know what an RDS broker is. You've seen it laid out on your server. You understand how that works. So now Azure is taking that responsibility on for you and letting you just manage the other side of the VM side. And that's the infrastructure piece that you're going to be responsible for once you deploy this in your environment. You can go ahead, Rob. So 3 things that kind of come up, right? Why does this work, and why are we doing it now? So we're all kind of in this situation that we're trying to give people access to resources that our probably don't even have access to. We do have a lot of schools that people are quarantined, and network admins are trying to do things from home, which can be difficult. So there's 3 things right now. There is no upfront capital costs. So there is no running through a board, going through the channels. You can get this up and running. Just understand that we are creating operating costs, and we will have those operating costs as long as you have assets in this environment. There is no termination fees. Once you shut something off and you completely get rid of all the resources in there that were attached to it, you won't see any charges from that anymore. And you only pay for what you use. There is a different pricing models available. There's 1-year pricing, 3-year pricing. Look for your regions and you'll see what's kind of available for you and what makes sense for you as an institution. Go to your next one. Okay, and this is what we're going to cover today. So what we're going over is going to be the Windows Virtual Desktop prereqs and the installation overview. We're going to touch base on the Azure cost and licensing requirements, and then go over the cloud security best practices for those. So how do you get started? So the first thing I like to do is plan this out. One thing you learn in Azure very quickly, for those that have been in it, it's not easy to delete things. Once you commit to writing, like a resource group cannot be renamed. You can move resources from one group to the next, but when you start tying solutions and other things to it, it can be difficult to move those items around. So what I tell people is, do a brainstorming session with the team. Write this all out. What is it going to look like? If there's other services that you're going to use as far as Azure is concerned, plan that out as part of this, because you have to understand that you're just adding a piece into an entire network. So the first thing is what we want to do, and I always say pay attention to regions, is because when you go to create things, you're going to see that they're going to put you in the best region in your area. But let's say that maybe you're not that's not where you want to have that, or you want redundancy, so you need to place things in other regions. So just pay attention to that, and as well as the services that are offered in your region. Sometimes when things are in preview, they'll only allow them in certain regions, and then they'll for general availability, then they'll release them to everyone. So just pay attention to that when you're looking at their roadmaps for when they're deploying things. And then there's other factors that you have to consider as well. What is this environment going to do for your institution? Are you just giving computing resources to people that don't have machines at home? Or are you trying to gain access to internal resources like file servers or ERP systems? And if you do want access to those resources, then you have to look at setting up a site-to-site tunnel, right? Is my firewall compatible with the Azure tenant? And if you go into Microsoft, they'll tell you these are the models that are compatible. And just understand, if you're going through product support, they're going to send you back and forth to each other. So sometimes you do have to do some of the legwork in setting those pieces up. For the domain requirements, and we'll talk about those requirements in a second, Azure AD Connect is how we're going to allow your on-prem Active Directory structure access to the Azure Active Directory. So when you need that set up, you may or may not need that. You just got to touch base with your infrastructure team, your systems administrators, and look at how your Active Directory is set up, so you can be prepared for the steps that you're going to need for these users to authenticate into this environment. One thing I like to do, and we will provide a worksheet for this, but create a naming convention that makes sense for you, that's going to help you stay organized in this environment. As you start to grow in Azure and you go to see, if you navigate in there and you go to all resources, you're going to be hit with 1 million resources in there if you have an entire infrastructure built up. It's going to make it a lot easier for you if you come up with a naming convention that makes sense for your institution. So if you're dealing with multiple cloud, I try to include AZ or AWS in the naming convention and the purpose of what you're doing in that environment. A few things to consider on the networking piece. For the virtual network, make sure you have enough addresses that's going to be for what you're going to be using your Azure tenant, your Azure subscription for. Because once you have that virtual network set up, we can't really modify that. We can add subnets within it, but if you don't start out with at least a /16 and start breaking that out, look at what you need and look at your growth as well. If this is something that you guys are putting in now for a temporary purposes, you may not want to rebuild it, and if it's something that you're going to be using in the next 3 to 5 years. So maybe you want to plan for that growth and accustom that, because that won't cost you anything to have these pieces set up. What will cost you is when you have a public IP address, when you have log storage, when you have disks staying in there. That's where you're going to see those charges kind of come up. For subnets, I tell people, look at the traffic that's on them. Like, we want to separate database traffic and things like that, and that will help you also monitor what's going on in your environment as well. And also if you're doing a site-to-site tunnel, it'll help you on your on-prem network, kind of see what that traffic is coming in and understanding what risk you're introducing into your environment. One thing I like to use when people don't have access to their Azure environment and they're not set up yet is we use the Bastion host, which Azure provides. You will need a subnet. It will have to be named Azure Bastion Network verbatim. You will need at least a /27 subnet for it. And what that will do is that will give you access to your VMs without using a public IP and having to use the insecure RDP session to that. You can go ahead, Rob. So this right here kind of gives you an idea of what the Azure Virtual Desktop overview looks like, how users are authenticating, where they're coming in at. There's a couple different ways that you can deploy it. If you see, the remote app host pool is more for when you're doing app deployment. We have the host pools that you can either have as personal or pooled. What is just dependent upon you. If you have a lab type of environment where users are used to like a deep freeze environment where they don't save things, they just come in, they use the software and they leave, then maybe the pooled is going to be useful for you. Keep those things in mind when you're designing this environment out. If you're using this for different departments and different software, and there's licensing limitations within them, you can build these pools out to support the licensing that you have in place. You just kind of have to play with it and understand and think of these machines as part of your network, because essentially once you join them to the domain, because the host will be, you can act with them with group policy and different domain functions that you currently have with your on-prem servers. So this is kind of a sample worksheet that we would kind of piece out. So let's say that we broke out your virtual network and we gave you your subnet range. Then what we would see is like your institution, AZ would be the cloud that we're on, VNet would be the item that we're in, and the region would be where we would, if you were separating regions. If that didn't make sense for you, some schools run in districts. So I have seen it where they make that, instead of region, they have the district name, and then they break out the subnets into the different schools that are in that district. We've seen that done as well for them, and that made sense. It's all about the management and what makes sense for you guys to organize this as far as roles and responsibilities go. Tagging is another one that I love to tell people to kind of look at for organization, because then we can use ownership and things like that, and you can really create those for your environment and give you some management and a quicker way to get to organization. So like if you had a guy that was leaving, let's say that you had a CISO and everything that was tagged with him, you could see what he was responsible for, because maybe there were certain servers or things in your environment that he wouldn't normally, other people wouldn't have access to. So you could quickly, flip those credentials off. So another thing is, you can stay on that slide real quick. A couple of these pieces to pay attention to that they won't tell you when you're doing the setup through Microsoft documentation is like your log analytics workspace, your automation account. Automation account is an important one. That is the one that you're going to use to create your identity, that your application, and you're also going to use that for your start-stop VM. So one thing to reduce cost in this environment is to reduce how long you have these resources available. Create a working window. I always suggest to people what makes sense for you. Leave the VMs on from 7 a.m. to 7 p.m. so you're not paying for those off-hour times, and that will help you decrease your monthly costs. You can go to the next one. So this is what's going to be common in every deployment for anybody in your environment. This is what's going to be needed for you, except for the last one. But if you don't do the last one, it would be more painful for you. So the first thing that we need is an Azure subscription. So some of you are familiar with working in Azure. You may have resources deployed in Azure. And then the two pieces that kind of get a little tricky is you do need Azure Active Directory domain services, and you need Azure Active Directory tenant. So if we went back to that drawing and we looked to see how users were authenticating, you need to be able to have those hosts joined to the domain, to your domain, before you go and add them as a host into this environment. If you don't have that ability from the Azure portal, your deployment will fail every time. So the other thing is, and we'll talk about that in a little bit, is the subscription license. We'll go over that in the next section. And then for the file server and the NetApp files is a newer way that they want to do it, and it is a little bit more better performance-wise. So instead of you having to maintain a file server to host your user profiles, you can actually just utilize NetApp storage space from within the Azure storage, but you do have to submit to use that service. So if you do want to look at NetApp files, I suggest that you go through the process and submit the form. If you go to Microsoft, you can look and it'll say permission for this, and you get contacted. But that is the only way to use that service right now. It's not available for you just to, spin it up. You can go ahead, Rob. So the first step, and the one step that you have to make sure that you do, is you have to consent to deploy the WVD and grant permissions. So that website, RD Web, one thing some people I've seen kind of had a misstep as, there's going to be a drop down on there, and you're going to want to make sure that you do allow permission from the desktop and from the client. And once that's created, it'll populate the applications over in your enterprise applications. Once they're over in your enterprise applications, as you can see on the screenshot, that one right there, the Windows Virtual Desktop, that's where you need to make sure that that user that's doing this right is going to have tenant creator permissions from that level. If you don't have tenant creator permissions, the next step is going to fail for you. So a couple PowerShell modules. If you're not familiar with PowerShell, I say get used to it. If you're going to have this environment, it makes it so much easier to manage things and to deploy new hosts. So the first one that is out is, these are the modules that you need to connect to that environment. And then after that, that second one, the connect to the WVD environment, that's going to be your starting point for a lot of the commands that you're going to run in here, because that's going to connect you to the environment and give you access to it. If once you're in there, if you're testing permissions and someone doesn't have ownership, the permission that you need is going to be an RDS owner. We have seen that error too. where they didn't grant RDS owner and there's 2 or 3 people working on a deployment and only one of them can add things. That is something that they don't tell you. You will find out the hard way when one of you tries to help the other person. And then the last one that you have to do before you run this deployment is to create that tenant name. Again, going back to that worksheet, this is something that you should have already kind of wrote out, have all this information just ready to plug it in when we go to the next step as well. So once you have your tenant created, it will come back, it will say successful, and then flip to the next one, Rob. So this one you guys may have seen if you have played in Azure. The next step is if everything is in place, you should be able to run this deployment and it should be successful. I'm putting shoulds in there because these do fail, and it fails on numerous random reasons. There is logs associated with this. So if you wanted to troubleshoot a deployment, you can always troubleshoot a deployment, or you can clear the resources away, you know, figure out the issues yourself and then redeploy this. This can also be used to deploy hosts to a pre-existing pool. So the first step that you're going to look when you run this wizard, you're going to go back and you're going to look at this is again, if you went back to that worksheet resource group. Now the resource group, usually what I would do is I would keep all your virtual desktops within the same resource group. When you're building out resource groups, the rule that they try to tell you to have is that everything in that resource group should be on the same life cycle. And that's what you should be kind of governing that resource group by. There is also, when you do this, make sure that you have your network security groups attached to the subnet levels, not at the NIC levels, because that will cause you a little bit more management, that unneeded management. And that used to be the old way of doing things. And another one for people that do a lot of application work, they have introduced application security groups. So kind of look at what it looks like to make sense for your organization and your institution, because a lot of the stuff that's in Azure, it's really custom to what makes sense for you guys as a team. Everybody's split out into different, you know, teams, and that will also help you control access to this environment and then lessen your threat landscape by not having as much permission open. The host pool name, that's again what we talked about. And the desktop type is again what we had touched base about, personal versus pooled. If you're setting this up the first time, do it as pooled so you can kind of see how that works and see how it handles. Because some people have a hard time with that concept. People kind of want to keep saving to the desktop. And that's why I said, if you don't set up your profiles, you're going to have random files all over the different hosts that you have set up. The next couple ones, the service metadata location, the reason they throw that in there too is some people have compliance reasons. So, you know, it just depending upon that, you can actually change the location there. And you don't have to worry about the default desktop users group unless you want to. That will just pre-populate. You can go ahead and go to the next one, Rob. So this one where it's kind of important is an availability set in the sense of Azure is going to be, I need one of these hosts available, is what you're telling Azure. So when we create this, we want them to know that these 3 hosts run our virtual desktop environment. So you need to make sure we have one of these available. So, and it doesn't cost anything itself for the availability set, but just understand that. And if you're adding a host after a deployment has already been deployed, make sure that you are putting that host in that availability set, because once you have that VM created, you cannot go back and add it to that availability set. The usage profile on here, this is saying an estimate of what you think your users are going to be. So they leave it kind of on medium. And then when you put in the total number of users, it's going to take those 2 and based on their calculations, tell you what size of the virtual machine that you want, that they think it needs for that user with that type of workload. Now, if you say that that's not what you want, you can actually go in and modify it based on what you know for your environment. Just go through and look. Also, just make sure that when you're doing that, if you're using accelerated networking, which we're not covering today, but if you're using accelerated networking, only certain sizes will allow that. So just look at everything as a whole and just make sure that the size that you choose is going to work for your environment. If this is your first time setting it up, set this up for 5 users, let it only deploy 1 host so you don't have a lot of cleanup tasks if it doesn't work. Because if you don't know, or you found out the hard way, if you delete a VM, there's still things in Azure that you have to go back and delete, or they just stay there. And for the prefix, this is going to be what the host, you're going to tell it to call the host. The host, now, when you do the prefix, just remember it's going to append a -0, a -1, a -2. So if your prefix is a dash, you're going to have servers named --, which we have seen happen before. Go ahead and go to the next one. So this is where you set the image for the VM itself. If you have an on-prem image that you have tested and it is a multi-session Windows 10, you can upload that to Azure Storage through Blob and present it here and use that to deploy your hosts. If you are new to this, you can actually just build a VM and create a master image and use it here as well. But just for the sake of this, what we did is there is a gallery image called Windows 10 Enterprise Multi-Session. It has O365, so it's already configured to run in this environment. So we usually just recommend just stay with what, with that. Unless you don't present O365, there is an image that is just the multi-session without that available. And then for the AD join and the admin password, if this fails and you get a domain join error on this deployment, that will be your local administrator password, username and password. So if you have a VM that you cannot get into after this, if you've ran this and you can't get into that VM, whatever account you use to set up, try it as a local account and you most likely will get in there. Now, going back to the worksheet on here as well, we have the virtual network. So what we're assuming is that you know what virtual network you're putting this in. So that goes back to that /16 that we had created in the beginning. And then we would select the subnet. For us, what we're going to do is we're going to keep all of our virtual desktop traffic together. So we created a subnet for it, and then we would select it here, and then we could go to the next step. So default tenant group, that's the one that normally shows up. You can keep it, you can change it. It's really up to you and works for you. The tenant name is what we've already created before.
In the PowerShell script.
Right, before this. And then the service principal, you can create a service principal. We recommend using a service principal, and you cannot use MFA with this. So that, again, goes back to creating your automation account. You're in Azure already, and that's where that service principal can live. It can all live within one automation account for the virtual desktop if you choose to, but just pay attention to regions because some regions don't allow some of the update management, which is another portion of that automation account. You can go to the next one, Rob. And that's pretty much how you run through this. And if it works, great. And if it doesn't, then you have a lot of fun just kind of going back and going through these steps again, just making sure that all those prereqs are kind of in place, because that's the biggest piece to this. And then after you got this working, we can connect a couple different ways. If you want to grant users rights, access to this environment, you can use that PowerShell command here. One caveat I will tell you is that they do not currently have a way to add a group in. So what you can do, and what we do is you can create a PowerShell script that will grab usernames out of a AD group and then put them in this group. That is a thing that is possible. So you won't have to, put them in one by one because it can be a large group of numbers. So what I suggest to people is to come up with a group, add the people into it, and then that be your group that you run that script. And then you can even utilize the Azure Runbook functionalities as well for some of the automation steps. And then the next one is you, Rob. On your iPhone.
That's just me having fun on my iPhone. So basically able to access the remote desktops, the Windows Virtual Desktop via my iPhone. You can access it via your iPad, Chromebook, any HTML5 browser, and really powerful stuff. And so from a costing perspective, it's what I would say is what we've learned is you each have your own individual negotiated deals with Microsoft. And so we've had, we see some environments where they get a, a $3,500 a year credit from Azure, which really helps in the costing of this. I've seen others that get discounts, others that get different types of credit types. This pricing calculator we have here is the pricing calculator for the general public and may not necessarily represent your state's negotiated deal with Microsoft or your institution's negotiated deal with Microsoft. But if you need, one of the things that we suggest is that you do a small rollout within a certain period. Once you set up the logs, you could really start to get an understanding what your real costs are going to be based on real-time usage patterns. And then that'll allow you to estimate the cost moving forward.
Rob, there was a question that came in. Enterprise user license, does education license not count?
Education license counts. We'll get to so getting into the licensing, what are the eligible Windows and M365 licenses to access WVD? So most of our clients are either under Microsoft 365 A3, A5, or student use benefits. All those three licenses qualify. Or if you're under the Windows 10 Education A3, A5, that counts. There's also the Windows 10 VDA per user. And so that's where most of our education license falls in under. So if you're already Microsoft 365 E3, then this is something that you already have licensed. So it's a great opportunity here. And we'd be happy to, what I would say is we got to look at your, part of it is to look at your individual licensing on a case-by-case basis. Because again, sometimes the states negotiate different types of deals and different types of rates, or if you're in a consortium, but we could certainly help you navigate that web. Additionally, for those of you, and I know there's some Windows 7 that still sits out there. If you do have some Windows 7 boxes that you can't upgrade, you do get the security updates if you migrate your Windows 7 to Windows Virtual Desktop. So nice way to keep that Windows 7 going.
Okay.
And so,
go ahead.
Go ahead.
So this one is, how do we secure it? When you talk about going remote, it usually freaks out the infrastructure team because they're like, one more door into the network, and now we're putting standard users and, on devices that we can't see. So, how do we secure it? So these are a couple things. So we had talked about this before a little bit earlier. And so set up user profiles for non-persistent environments. If you're using session, pool, if you're using the pooled, then use the NetApp files or the FS Logics. FS Logics that license actually already comes with the SKU, so you don't even have to pay extra for that. So at least you could actually see where all the files are going and have a centralized location for it, as well. If you can, use conditional access and MFA to secure your tenant. In Azure, you have your AD sign-in logs, you have your audit logs. Get familiar with what your traffic baseline is. Understand what traffic looks like for you as an institution, where your traffic is coming from. For conditional access, you can do trusted locations. You can block certain countries. If there's certain countries that you see keep hitting your network that you don't do business with, there's multiple ways that you can kind of get in front of some of the risks that's involved. Multi-factor is a big one as well. There is some tricks with doing it with virtual desktop. One caveat is that there is going to be 2 sign-ins. You have, when you go to log into the actual portal itself, you have one to sign you into Azure, one that authenticates you to the machine. The machine authentication, they have trouble making that MFA, but you can definitely MFA the first login for users. And then the other one that I tell people is to lock down the session host using group policy. Group policy will really give you a lot of control over what you're presenting to the end user. So for me, what I lock people down and what I secure is, let's turn off control panel. Let's turn off network connections. Let's turn off the ability to shut that host machine down. locking them to the point where they should only be in there doing what you gave them access to do in that environment. The Windows Virtual Desktop uses a reverse connection, so you're not even exposed. There is no inbound ports needed with this, and it gets really easy to manage it as long as you have the security in place that you need for the data that these users are accessing in your environment. One thing that we had touched base a little bit earlier was the Bastion, right? So Azure Bastion is using SSL, and it's not using a public IP to give you the same functionality that you would have in an RDP session to that host. When you're setting this environment up, or your first VM, and maybe you don't have your site-to-site tunnel up and you need access to that VM, Bastion's a great way for you to get access to it with still remaining secure and not exposing yourself to the outside world. You can go to the next one. And this again is the reverse connection that I had kind of spoken about. So the technology, the reason we call it reverse is because, in the traditional setup, you go through the broker, you come out to the machine. Well, instead, we're reaching back into that environment. And because it's managed by Microsoft, we're not going outside to make that connection happen for us. And this one's a big one. So to be secure, and what I say is understand where your responsibility comes in and what you should be maintaining and what they're maintaining for you. So what you're always going to be responsible for is you're going to be responsible for your data. You're going to be responsible for your endpoints, your account, and access management. Those are the 4 things that you will be responsible for, regardless of what service you're using in the Azure environment. This is a breakout of Microsoft and kind of what they provide and where you kind of fall in line. And the reason that's important is because a lot of people make the assumption that because that virtual machine is up in their environment that they're updating it. It's not the case. They do offer you free tools. There is update management that is available. Again, it goes back to creating that run book in Azure, putting the security policies and procedures in place to make sure that you're ready to support that cloud security architecture that's coming online. So you can go to the next one here. I think that was, so, okay, that's fine. So one other thing is, again, I'll just reiterate. So when it comes to the best practices for this, the links that I put here is the cloud adoption framework and the shared responsibility. Get familiar with those documents if you're going to move into the Microsoft world and you're going to start putting resources up there, so you understand what your data looks like up there and also what users have access to. Limit the number of global administrators you have on your subscription. We see that one a lot. The rule of thumb is 5 or lower. We've seen up to 30 before. Use role-based access for people. Only give them permission to do what they need to do in your environment. And making sure that that environment that you're bringing this WVD technology into can support it and can also secure it at the same time in the same way that you would support your on-prem resources. And that's it.
We want to open it up for any questions. Oh, we have one right there. Jason, and if you have any context, I will read the question. Do we have to set up multiple golden images for the unique lab application setups, or is there a way to manage single application and then deploy it to the golden image based on who logs in?
So yeah, so you can actually just do a single application. So if we went back and we looked, instead of looking at the virtual desktop, look at the app deployment. And app deployment, that's where you're going to see that app right there, because then you can present that to a group of users. So right up there, the remote app host pool. So again, if you start trying to do applications, but also look at the licensing piece of that as well, depending upon the application, because some of that licensing can get tricky.
Okay. Any other context, Jason, that you wanted to add, or does that answer your question? You may still be on mute. So.
Okay, so for CAD, a lot of people have CAD. So for CAD, I mean, depending on cost, I know people aren't gonna like this cost, but look at the GPU hosts. If you're talking about AutoCAD, and then now if you're looking at SolidWorks, SolidWorks is going to be more of the AWS app stream. It's very, very compatible with it. And so, but again, in Azure, it's kind of that same deal where you're going to have to set it up as an application and then present the application to the users. because when we're doing the virtual desktop, we're presenting them the desktop. Kind of the same thing that you would do as an on-prem RDS.
Okay. Okay.
I think there's more questions that
Yeah,
came
there's a
in.
Yeah.
couple that just popped in. So we are currently a VM shop. That's why he asked. Okay, got that. We use Intune for app deployments on-prem. Windows Virtual Desktop added support for Intune. Has that happened yet, Christine?
I have not seen anybody try to use Intune with Windows Virtual Desktop. Now, it just depends. Now, for management purposes, what I have seen is that they will use the ATP portion, and then they will allow you to, like I said, the update management, it's a third. It goes through those run books instead, unfortunately. And I'm hoping that they start doing it, but I have not seen them put anything in the roadmap right now for Intune.
Okay. And Thomas, feel free to pop off of mute if you have any additional context that you wanted to add.
No, that was it, but excellent job on the webinar. I appreciate it.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you.
I'll take all the credit.
If you would have sang, I would have gave it to you.
See, there you go.
Disappointed.
Okay, then we have Andrew. VMware Horizon has app volumes where you can.
I think that was an
desktop.
answer to the other VMware,
Oh, got you. Not a question. Okay.
right? Where you can run that with custom applications. Yeah. I think that's an answer to the other VMware shop.
Thank you. An option. Thank you, Andrew. Appreciate it. Okay. Any additional questions? Anything that we have not answered? Feel free to pop off of mute if you don't want to type at this point.
Mm-hmm. That's where the money. See, that's why I tell people look at licensing. Look at licensing. And another thing is too, just so you guys know, when you're in Azure, like setting up Bastion host, it's like $15 per host if you were running it all the time. So that's why if it's not cost effective for you, just utilize it during the deployment phase. You know, it's great to have, but if your budget doesn't cut it, you know, that's where I said just keep looking at that. And as well as if you go into Azure and you look under subscription, just look at subscriptions. If you should see the cost, the current cost right there in the portal.
Okay, so software development by students in Visual Studio. Any restrictions on students programming?
No, we've had a couple that use Visual Studio, and it actually works really well in there in that environment. Now, one thing I will say for performance for the hosts, when you're speccing this out, there is different ways that you can set up. Like the one that we had spoken about was the start stop based on the off hours. You can actually create one that is based on performance. So you can tell Azure to say, don't, you know, turn this host on when you see performance on this run for X, Y, and Z. So then that way you don't have them running all the time, because the way to cut down costs in this environment is to make sure that you're only offering what you need to use and shutting it down and keeping those shut down. For if you're doing imaging within Azure, you know, when you're doing imaging in Azure, make sure that you're not using managed disk. Make sure that you're putting it in the blob storage and using that URI and creating the image from there, because if you do it that way, again, that'll cut your costs down when you're in this environment.
Okay, great. Any additional questions?
In your experience, you know, just deploying this out in other places, what do you see as best practices for using Azure pools versus using the personal machines? Like, are other enterprises doing personal machines for their staff and faculty and then app pools for students, or what's the mix that you're seeing there?
So one I have is districts. And so what they did is they have their pools based on what are their main colleges. So they have different domains that are underneath their tenant. It's a little bit confusing, but so they separated theirs based on campus because that was more important for them for their organization unit. And that's how their IT staff was. They were very driven by what campus they worked at. Another way that we have seen them deploy pools is that we do one that will be based on security, right? So we want to create one that's a general pool. So we would do like student pool, and then like your site to site tunnel, you'd have 2 connections, or you'd have a connection and you would say only send these ones over to the student side. So that way they could make the students not get into the admin side, because that was a big concern as well, because that is usually we have those networks separated when we're on campus. We have seen that as well. So when your very first pool, do it as only like 2 hosts. And, when you're writing this out, depending upon like how many campuses are you guys, like what makes sense for you? Like how big is your IT organization for you guys? Like who would be managing this environment for you? I think Thomas is who was speaking, right? You're muted.
I'm sorry.
It's okay.
How many? It would be, we're a pretty small college, and I'd basically be the only one adminning it.
Okay.
But I meant more towards like the benefits between using the shared pool versus the one-to-one personal VDI.
So the difference with that is how long are they going to use it? So if you have users that come in every day and they need to use this for 9 to 5, like you said, for administration or things like that, and this is replacing their device, yes, then go towards the one-to-one, give them their own desktop. Now, if it's more for cost-effective reasons and it's just more what's available, what's the best resources, that's where the student side comes in, or that's where those shared pools come in, and that's where you would kind of do the pooled sessions. I don't recommend the personal ones unless you want to maintain it, because again, it comes down to how much storage that you want to keep in Azure. So the reason I recommend for people to go towards the session and the pooled is because we have a lot of people that don't save to the cloud, and we tell them to, right? We say, okay, you have OneDrive or you have Google Drive, but they don't save there. So if you have an A3 or an A5 licensing, you have cloud account security broker built into your account. So you can use that from the Microsoft and stop PII and stop people from downloading things from there. If that makes sense.
Yeah, perfect sense.
And then that way, so when you create those pools, if you guys were a smaller school, then go towards the one that's going to be more of the sessions and handing it out, because you're going to see better operating costs with that option. And just make people, it's again setting those expectations of what they're going to see when they log in. If everybody has a really slow internet connection at home and they're logging into this machine and it keeps dropping them, it's not the machine's fault, it's actually their fault, and we can't help that. So again, it's also making sure that you set those expectations with the end users that are going to be using this environment.
Yeah, and I would say just from a cost perspective, majority have gone pools for both staff and for both students and employees. What I will say is we use where I would say if for Relly we use personal is for people that got, for employees that have to VPN to different sites. But if they're just coming to your site and they're able and they have cloud storage available to them, pools will work perfectly for them. Maybe maybe for an executive you might want to give personal to, but if use pools whenever possible.
Perfect. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
All right. Any additional questions? Okay. Well, thank you everyone for joining. As I said, this will be made available for you. We really appreciate everyone taking the time, and we look forward to you joining our next webinar. Next week, we actually have FA implications that are coming up. So really look forward to it. Thank you guys. Appreciate it.
And again, if you have ideas for other webinars that you would like us to do, we're trying to come out with the series based on the demands we're seeing in consulting. Feel free to email info@forelli.com with your suggestions. Again, we're looking at the types of consulting that we see coming in, and as a we're trying to get education out there on the high demand items to help as many people as possible.
Everyone.
Thank you.